Okay, so in the last lecture I talked a bit about what arguments are, or at least arguments in the sense that we're interested in them in a philosophy class, right? Argument is we give, or a person gives some series of statements, sometimes just a single statement, but usually a series, to support another statement. The statements that are the first premises, the second conclusion, right? We have a series of premises, or at least one premise that's supposed to support a conclusion. But, the main thing we want to do in philosophy is to evaluate arguments. Well, one of the main things, right? We want to learn to make good arguments ourselves. But, these are kind of very, very closely related. Well, so how do we evaluate arguments? Well, there's a few different ways. Actually, there's a lot of different ways. You could teach whole classes on logic. We, in fact, do here. Excuse me, we don't have time for that. But I want to talk about a few simple ways of evaluating arguments. And probably the simplest and the first step you really want to do a lot of times when you want to evaluate any argument in detail is to put the argument in standard form. You'll also hear this sometimes called distilling the argument. So how do you do this? You find the premises and the conclusion, or conclusions. Every now and then an argument will have more than one conclusion. That's a little bit rare, but it does happen, right? We won't really do arguments like that, but just be aware they exist. So you find the premises and the conclusion, and you put it in a numbered form with the premises first and the conclusion at the end, right? A lot of times arguments won't have the conclusion at the end. They'll have it at the beginning. They're well written. Sometimes at the end, sometimes in both places. But, people don't always write well, right? Sometimes you'll see badly written arguments and they'll have the conclusion stuck somewhere in the middle, right? Anyway, so how do we do this, right? So first we look at an argument and we figure out what's the conclusion, right? Vaughan gives you a series of words that kind of like are going to tip offs for what the conclusion are. Because, therefore, since, so, words like that. That's a good clue, right? But I think it's more important just to get a feel for what the conclusion is, right? The conclusion is the statement that the whole argument is supposed to support, right? So a lot of times, people won't use these indicator words, and if they don't, just ask yourself, well, what is this person trying to prove? What are they trying to show? So look at this very short argument. I think I took this from Vaughan. If I didn't, I took it from some other logic book. Abortion is not morally wrong. If it were morally wrong, it would be illegal, and it is not illegal, right? So what's our conclusion here, right? What's the statement this person's trying to prove? Also, just to say, for all the arguments I give you guys here, I'm neither endorsing or not endorsing any of these, right? Maybe this is a good argument, maybe it's a bad argument. I don't know. Actually, I can't avoid tipping my hand. I think this is kind of a bad argument. Neither here nor there on the ethics of abortion, but plenty of things that are immoral aren't illegal, but whatever. Can't help myself, but let's just look back at this argument, right? What's our conclusion? Abortion is not morally wrong, right? So, red, our conclusion, blue, our premises. So when we look at this statement with the premises, there's actually, how many things is this saying? It's actually saying two things. If abortion were morally wrong, it would be illegal, and it's also saying it's not illegal, right? So we break that one sentence up where there's two premises into two premises, put those first, and the conclusion at the end. If abortion were morally wrong, it would be illegal. It's not illegal, so it's not morally wrong. Here's another one, much simpler, much less controversial, I'm going to guess. The President of the U.S. is a federal employee. Since Biden is president, he is a federal employee. What's the conclusion? What's the statement that all these other statements support? Well, that Biden is a federal employee, right? We put that in red. you know, what are our premises? The president of the U.S. is a federal employee. Biden is president. So, president of the U.S. is a federal employee. Biden is president of the U.S. Therefore, Joe Biden is a federal employee, right? And you'll notice that sometimes we rewrite the premises or the conclusion a little bit as we put them into standard form. You want to be careful not to change the meaning, but a lot of times you want, you want to make things clear. You also might want to cut things down a little bit. It's one of the reasons we call this distilling. A lot of times when we distill an argument, it ends up being a lot shorter than what's on the page. We'll know, I'll show you guys in a minute, there's a lot of times stuff on the page that's not really relevant to the argument. People also sometimes repeat themselves. You want to cut all of that out. One more example. The Kennedy assassination was not a conspiracy. If it were a conspiracy, there would be some hard evidence of such a conspiracy, but there isn't. What's our conclusion? Again in red. Kennedy assassination was not a conspiracy. If it were a conspiracy, there would be some hard evidence of such a conspiracy, but there isn't. If the Kennedy assassination were a conspiracy, there would be hard evidence of a conspiracy. There is no hard evidence of a conspiracy. Therefore, the Kennedy assassination was not a conspiracy. Now, these are all kind of artificially simple, right? Here we don't need to do much more than just take the sentences in the argument, rearrange them a little bit, put the conclusion at the end, number the rest of them, right? I'm not going to have you guys do a lot of distilling argument. It's good enough that you know what it is. I'll distill the arguments we come across a lot of times, put them in standard form just to make it easier to evaluate. You guys really won't need to do that much of it, but it's not a bad skill to know and understand, right? Sometimes when you're evaluating arguments we read, it might not be bad to just try to distill them, put them down as you understand them. That might help you to understand what's going on. So let's look at an actual much more complex argument, or at least longer argument, and see how we'd distill this, right? Because, there is more going on than these short artificial arguments I've been giving you guys. Inflation isn't going anywhere anytime soon. For one thing, supply chain issues that are driving much of the current inflation are not likely to be resolved in the near future. In fact, supply chain issues will get worse if there's another major COVID wave in the US, Asia, or Europe. And there's a good chance there will be another COVID wave in one of those places. Finally, the Russia-Ukraine war will push inflation higher as long as it goes on. The supply chain will not improve quickly. COVID is still out there, and the Russia-Ukraine war will drive up inflation, all of which means that inflation is here to stay for the next few months or even years. Well, look, some of this is repetitive, right? Look at the end of the argument. Everything from the supply chain will not improve quickly. That sentence just restates what the other sentences have said, right? The first sentence here is not a bad statement of our conclusion. The last statement, all of which means that inflation is here to stay, restates the conclusion, right? So look, before you distill this, get rid of anything that is repetitive, right? Inflation isn't going, all this stuff in yellow is repetitive, just cut it, right? A premise doesn't gain any power, doesn't become any more convincing because you say it a bunch of times. If you repeat yourself a bunch of times, that might be a way to persuade people, but it doesn't give it any more rational support. That's what we're interested in, right? So get rid of it, and then distill your argument once that stuff's gone. Supply chain issues are not likely to be resolved. They'll get worse, so there's another COVID wave. Good chance there'll be another COVID wave in one of the places we mentioned. Russia-Ukraine war will push inflation higher as long as the war goes on. Inflation isn't going anywhere anytime soon. Also, when you're putting an argument in standard form and distilling it, you want to get rid of the rhetoric, right? A lot of times arguments in real life will have rhetoric mixed in with reasons. Remember, rhetoric isn't relevant to the argument. It really isn't even part of the argument if you're being kind of strict about this, right? You want to evaluate, you want to look at the reasons someone gives you to think the belief is true. You don't want to look at the rhetoric, right? Because that doesn't give you any reason, you know, that's not at all relevant to evaluating the reasons, the rational support a belief might have. So here's an example. You know, this is the Kennedy argument that I gave you guys before. I've just thrown in some rhetoric here, right? Despite what the tinfoil hat crowd might think, the Kennedy assassination was not a conspiracy. If it were a conspiracy, there would be some hard evidence of such a conspiracy, but there isn't. One can only pity all those people who were so dumb as to believe things without good evidence, right? Well, look. Stuff about the tinfoil hat crowd, you know, this, oh, I pity these people, you know, name calling, even more commonly, oh, I pity people, whatever. These are rhetorical moves. They don't give any additional reason to think this is true. Put them in red here. You know, if you were evaluating the argument, you cut this stuff before you distill the argument because it's not really part of the argument, right? So we're back to our original statement, back to distilling it the way we originally did, right? So when you're distilling an argument, you know, put the premises in numbered form with the conclusion at the end, but also before you even do all that, go through, find stuff that's repetitive and get rid of it. Also, find any rhetoric and get rid of it. Those aren't relevant to evaluating an argument. You know, repeating a premise doesn't give it any more power, doesn't give it any more weight than it has if it's there one time, and rhetoric is just not relevant. Ignore it. Don't let it have an effect on you.